The first shot shattered the afternoon quiet of Silver Creek's main street. Mason Redwood's instincts took over before his mind registered danger. Colt in hand, body pivoting toward the three men spread before him, their dusters snapping in the hot New Mexico wind of 1878. "Redwood Colonel Hawkins sends his regards." The center man spat words striking Mason harder than any bullet could. 3 shots later, Mason stood alone among the fallen. The leader's final whisper carried on the settling dust. "Hawkins, we'll find you." Sheriff Cooper stepped from the Shadows badge, catching the sunlight. "Those were Hawkins's men." "They were waiting for me, Nathan," Mason confirmed, holstering his weapon with steady hands that belied the turmoil within. 7 years of peace shattered in 30 seconds of gunfire. "Recognize them?" Cooper asked, kneeling beside the nearest man. "7th Cavalry. Not my unit, but—" Mason turned one man's wrist to reveal a small tattoo, a hawk with outstretched talons. "Hawkins's men right enough? Thought that business was long buried." Mason's laugh was hollow. "Some graves don't stay filled, Nathan." Cooper studied his friend's face. "You want to tell me what this is about?" "Old debts." Mason looked down the dusty street toward the edge of town where his ranch waited, empty and silent as it had been for 7 years. "Nothing for you to worry about. 3 dead men in my street says different. I'll be at the ranch if you need my statement." "Mason," Cooper called after him. "Whatever's coming, you don't have to face it alone." But Mason was already walking away, his shoulders set in a rigid line that said clearer than words alone was all he knew now. The ride back to the Redwood Ranch was 5 miles of dust and memory. Mason pushed his sorrel gelding harder than necessary, as if outrunning the ghosts the gunfight had stirred up. The name echoed in his mind with each hoofbeat. Hawkins, 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 Roland Hawkins, once a respected cavalry colonel, now a wealthy businessman with interests across the territory. And a man Mason had hoped never to see again. The ranch house materialized against the darkening sky, its 2-story silhouette a painful reminder of misplaced hope. Mason had raised those walls himself in the heady days after the war, each nail and beam intended for a family that never came, for children's footsteps, that never echoed for Rebecca's laughter that faded into memory. Now it loomed like a hollow cathedral consecrated to absence. Inside, Mason moved through the quiet rooms like a ghost. He hung his gun belt by the door, a habit Rebecca had insisted upon. In the kitchen, he poured 3 fingers of whiskey and drank it in one swallow. He pulled a leather journal from the shelf. For 7 years, he'd kept this ritual. Each day the same words, Day 2, 5:57, without Rebecca. Mason stared at the page pen hovering. After a moment he added, "Hawkins has found me." Outside, the New Mexico sun slipped behind the mountains, painting the land in blood and gold. Mason watched darkness claim his ranch, knowing that somewhere out there old enemies were circling closer. A week after the gunfight, the worst dust storm in 5 years swept across Silver Creek. By noon, the world outside Mason's windows had disappeared behind a wall of churning dust. That's when he heard it, a sound so out of place, it froze him mid-step. A baby's cry. Mason grabbed his shotgun, wrapped a bandana around his face, and stepped into the maelstrom. The wind hit him like a physical blow, visibility near zero. The crying grew louder as he approached the corral. "Hello?" His voice vanished into the howling wind. "Is someone there?" Beyond the barn, huddled against the corral fence, he found a shape too substantial to be a trick of the light. A woman curled protectively around a bundle in her arms. "Ma'am," he called, "you all right?" The woman's head jerked up, revealing a face streaked with blood and dust. Dark eyes, wide with fear, locked onto his shotgun, then his face. She clutched the bundle tighter. "Stay back!" Her voice was raw, barely audible above the wind. The accent was slight, but unmistakable, Mexican or Spanish. Mason set the shotgun down deliberately, raising empty hands. "I'm not going to hurt you. This is my ranch. Let me help you inside." The woman's gaze darted past him, searching the swirling dust, as if expecting others. The bundle in her arms moved, and another weak cry emerged. "Your baby needs shelter," Mason said, taking a step closer. "This storm could last for days." For a long moment, the woman remained frozen. Then the baby cried again, and something in her broke. She nodded once, sharply. "Can you walk?" Mason asked. She flinched from his hand, but struggled to her feet independently, swaying dangerously. Her dress was torn and stained with blood, both fresh and dried. Her face bore a deep cut along one cheekbone. "My son," she managed her voice, barely a whisper. "He's only 4 months old. He hasn't had water since yesterday." The infant's cries had weakened to whimpers, a sound that tightened something in Mason's chest. He'd thought, long dead. Inside, Mason guided her to the kitchen. She sank into a chair, still clutching the baby, despite her evident weakness. "Water," she managed, looking at the infant rather than herself. Mason brought a cup, helping her hold it to the baby's parched lips. The child couldn't be more than a few months old. "He needs milk," the woman said, desperation edging her voice. "Do you have a cow? A goat?" "Goat's milk in the cellar," Mason replied, "and some stored cow's milk. Which would be better?" "Goat," she answered immediately. Watered down and warm. While he prepared it as instructed, the woman rocked gently, murmuring to her son in Spanish. "What's your name, ma'am?" Mason asked, testing the milk's temperature on his wrist, as he'd once seen Rebecca do with their neighbor's infant. The woman hesitated. "Isabella," she finally said. "Isabella Diaz. This is Gabriel." Mason handed her the milk. "Mason Redwood. This is my ranch." Isabella helped Gabriel drink, relief washing over her face. Only when he'd had his fill did she finally take the water Mason offered her. "You're hurt," Mason said, gesturing to the cut on her face. "It's nothing. I've had worse." The casual statement told Mason more about her life than 100 words of explanation could have. "Still needs cleaning," he insisted. "Wounds get infected quick in this country." He gathered supplies, clean cloth, water, whiskey, and set them on the table. Isabella insisted on tending to it herself. While she cleaned her face, Mason built up the fire and set a pot of coffee to brew. The storm continued its assault outside. "How did you end up at my ranch in the middle of a dust storm?" Mason asked. "We were traveling to Santa Fe," she said carefully. "Got caught in the storm." Mason recognized a half-truth when he heard one. The nearest road was 2 miles east, and no one accidentally stumbled onto his property, especially not in a dust storm. "There's a bedroom upstairs," he said instead. "First door on the left. You and your son can rest there until the storm passes." Isabella's eyes widened slightly. "Thank you, but we'll leave as soon as the storm breaks." "That could be days," Mason pointed out, "and you're in no condition to travel." She started to protest, then looked down at Gabriel. "Why would you help strangers?" The question caught Mason off guard with its directness. Why indeed? 7 years he'd lived alone, avoiding entanglements. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. Isabella studied his face as if searching for the lie behind the sentiment. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "Just until the storm passes." Mason woke before dawn, an old habit from his scouting days. He was on his second cup of coffee when he heard a floorboard creak from the direction of the back door. "I need to leave. Now. Please." Just let us go." Mason turned slowly. Isabella stood in the doorway, Gabriel clutched to her chest, a small knife gripped in her free hand. Her eyes were wide, desperate. "The storm's still bad out there," he said calmly, making no move toward his gun. "Not safe for traveling, especially with a baby." "We're not safe here either," Isabella countered. "They'll come looking." "Who will? Don't pretend you don't know." The knife trembled slightly. "Hawkins's men. That's why you helped us, isn't it? To collect whatever reward he's offering." The name hit Mason like a physical blow. "Hawkins!" he repeated. "Roland Hawkins." Something in his tone made Isabella hesitate. You're not working for him." "No!" The word came out harder than Mason intended. "I'm about the last man on earth who'd work for Roland Hawkins." "Then you know who he is." "I know him." Mason gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Please, sit. That knife won't do you much good anyway, and you look about ready to collapse." After a moment of assessment, Isabella lowered the knife slightly. "What kind of history?" "We served together during the war. I was a scout in his unit for a time." "You were friends." Suspicion hardened her voice again. "We were soldiers." Mason's tone made clear the distinction. "Why is Hawkins after you, Mrs. Diaz?" Isabella flinched at the formal address. "It's just Isabella now. My husband is dead." "I'm sorry. Hawkins had him killed." The blunt statement hung in the air. 3 days ago, though your husband crossed him somehow. Mateo discovered what Hawkins's trading company really does." Isabella's voice grew stronger, anger overcoming fear. "It's not just cattle and goods. He moves people across the border. Women and children sold like animals. Your husband had proof, ledgers, records of sales, names of officials being paid to look the other way." Isabella finally sank into the chair. "Mateo was Hawkins's bookkeeper. He trusted my husband because Mateo was Apache. Thought no one would believe him if he talked. But your husband did talk. He gathered evidence, planned to take it to the federal authorities." Isabella's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "Hawkins found out. Made me watch while they... She broke off, clutching Gabriel tighter. "They wanted information," she continued after regaining control. "Names of others who knew, location of the evidence Mateo had gathered." Pride entered her voice. "I told them nothing." "How did you escape?" "One guard, less careful than the others. I took his knife while he slept. Then I took his horse." The matter-of-fact description impressed Mason more than any elaboration could have. This woman had steel in her spine. "Why come here?" he asked. "To my ranch specifically." Isabella hesitated, then reached into her torn bodice, withdrawing a folded piece of paper. She placed it on the table between them. "This is why." Mason unfolded the paper. A single line of neat handwriting stared back at him. "If anything happens, find Mason Redwood at Silver Creek. He owes me a life." The shock of seeing Mateo's name signed below must have shown on Mason's face. Mateo Diaz. Mason breathed memory from 3 years ago rushing back. Apache man educated back east. Spoke 4 languages. 5, Isabella corrected automatically. He was learning Chinese. We met 3 years ago. I was tracking rustlers who'd crossed into Apache territory. Got ambushed instead. Would have died if your husband hadn't intervened. He never told me he saved your life. He saved me, tended my wounds, got me back to town. Mason folded the paper carefully. When I asked why he'd helped a white man, he said something I never forgot. A man's worth isn't in his blood or background, but in what he does when no one's watching. Isabella's expression softened. That sounds like Mateo. I didn't know he worked for Hawkins. He took the position a year ago after the school where we taught was closed. Bitterness crept into Isabella's voice. The territorial governor decided educating Apache and Mexican children wasn't worth the expense. So you came here because Mateo thought I would help. I had nowhere else to go. Isabella looked down at Gabriel. Hawkins wants us both. Me for what I know. And Gabriel, why the child? Mateo's parents owned land near Silver Creek. A silver mine. Isabella's voice dropped. When they died, it passed to Mateo, and now to Gabriel. Hawkins wants it. With us gone, he could claim Gabriel as his ward, take control of everything. The pieces clicked into place. Land acquisition had always been Hawkins's obsession, even during the war. The note says, I owe Mateo a life, Mason said slowly. He was right. Isabella's gaze was direct, challenging. Will you honor that debt? Mason looked at the woman before him, exhausted, injured but unbroken, and the child in her arms. Taking in Isabella and Gabriel meant inviting Hawkins's wrath down upon his head. Yet refusing meant betraying a debt of honor to a good man. And perhaps something else, a chance to face the demons that had haunted him since the war, since Rebecca. Yes, he said finally. I'll help you, both of you. Relief washed over Isabella's face so profound it transformed her features. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet, Mason cautioned. Hawkins isn't a man who gives up what he wants. And if he's looking for you, he'll find you eventually, even here. I know, Isabella's chin lifted. But I'm tired of running, tired of being afraid. Outside, the wind had finally begun to die down, the worst of the storm passing. But Mason Redwood knew that the most dangerous storm was yet to break upon them. The familiar terror visited him again that night. It always began with the same frantic ride, his horse lathered and heaving beneath him, the horizon tilting as some invisible weight pressed against his chest. Above the ranch, storm clouds gathered where no clouds should be. Then came the desperate sprint across the yard, the door splintering beneath his shoulder, his voice breaking as he called her name. And always the same tableau awaited their bedroom, transformed into a chamber of dying light. Rebecca's skin translucent with fever, her once bright eyes dulled to vacant pools, her fingers burning like brands reaching weakly for his. You're here, she would whisper, a terrible relief in those simple words. Then the line that haunted him, still, I held on as long as I could. Mason jolted awake, sweat-soaked sheets twisted around him. For a disorienting moment, he expected to find himself in the small cabin they'd first shared. But reality reasserted itself. The master bedroom of the ranch house. 7 years without Rebecca. And now guests under his roof for the first time since the funeral. In the kitchen he found Isabella already there, Gabriel cradled in one arm. The infant's dark eyes followed Mason's movements. There's coffee, Isabella offered. And I made biscuits. The ordinary domesticity before him felt like a scene from another man's life. Since Rebecca's passing, his routine had calcified into ritual solitary meals, taken standing at the counter, conversations held only with memory and regret. The house had become less a home than a mausoleum where he merely resided. Yet, here was a table set for 2 coffee brewed by another, hand food prepared with care. He hadn't requested small intrusions of life into his carefully maintained tomb. They ate in companionable silence, broken only by Gabriel's occasional babbling. Mason found himself watching Isabella when she wasn't looking, The graceful economy of her movements, the way sunlight caught the dark waves of her hair. "You mentioned Hawkins was your commanding officer," Isabella said finally, "during the war." Mason nodded, setting down his fork. "For about a year. I was a scout attached to his unit, 8th Cavalry. Mateo said he was a monster, even back then. He was effective. The kind of officer who got results no matter the cost. Some called that leadership. Others saw it for what it was. And what was that? Cruelty dressed up as duty." Mason's voice hardened. He'd sacrifice anyone, burn any village if it served his objectives. After the war, he took those same talents into business. Isabella studied his face. "You despise him." "I do. Yet you served under him." "War makes strange bedfellows, Mrs. Diaz. I've done things I'm not proud of, following Hawkins's orders among them." Isabella absorbed this, her expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. "What happened between you? There's more than just dislike there." Mason had never spoken of this to anyone. The weight of it had been his alone to carry for 7 years. "Rebecca, my wife, died 7 years ago while I was hunting Hawkins and his men," he said finally, the words feeling rusty with disuse. "I was 31 then. She came down with fever. Sent for me, but I was 3 days' ride away, tracking rustlers." "Rustlers working for Hawkins," Isabella guessed. Mason nodded. "I didn't know it then. By the time I got back—" His throat closed around the words. "She was gone," Isabella finished softly. "I should have been here." The admission felt torn from somewhere deep inside him. "She called for me," neighbors said. "Kept asking when I'd be home." Isabella's hand moved as if to reach for his, then withdrew. "You couldn't have known." "Doesn't change the fact that she died alone." Mason pushed back from the table, the familiar guilt rising. "While I was chasing ghosts? Is that why you live alone? Some kind of penance?" The directness of the question startled Mason. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just not fit company for decent folk anymore." Isabella's gaze was steady, assessing. "My husband trusted you. He was a good judge of character." "Your husband met me once 3 years ago. Mateo saw people clearly. If he believed you would help us, he had his reasons." Isabella rose, gathering the breakfast dishes. "Perhaps better reasons than the ones you used to punish yourself." Mason opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. There was something in Isabella's tone. Not pity, but a kind of recognition. She too carried guilt, he realized. Survivor's guilt, perhaps. The burden of being the one left behind. "Hawkins will come looking eventually," he said instead. "When he does, you need to be ready." "Ready how?" "Can you shoot?" Isabella's expression hardened. "I can learn." "Good." Mason nodded. "We'll start today." As he rose, Mason caught sight of his reflection in the window glass. A stranger looking back at him, a man whose solitary existence had been disrupted by a young woman, an infant, and ghosts from a past he'd tried to outrun. For 7 years he'd been half alive, going through the motions of existence without purpose, beyond simple survival. Now danger was riding toward his ranch in the form of an old enemy threatening 2 innocent lives he'd pledged to protect. And somewhere deep within, in a place Mason had thought long dead, a spark flickered to life. Not hope. He was too far gone for that. But perhaps something like purpose. A reason to fight that went beyond mere survival. 2 weeks passed in a rhythm Mason hadn't experienced since Rebecca's death. The solitary routine that had defined his existence gave way to something new. A household with needs beyond his own voices that broke the silence of empty rooms. On the morning of the 15th day, Mason brought his old Henry rifle to the breakfast table. "Time you learn to use this," he said, setting it carefully beside Isabella's plate. She eyed the weapon, then him. "You think they're coming soon?" It wasn't a question. In the past 2 weeks, Isabella had proven herself observant, quick to read unspoken thoughts. "I know Hawkins," Mason confirmed. "He doesn't give up what he considers his." After breakfast, they walked to the far side of the corral where Mason had set up targets, tin cans arranged on fence posts at varying distances. "Have you ever fired a gun before?" he asked, checking the rifle's action. "Once. My father's shotgun." Isabella's expression darkened. "When men came to our farm in Mexico, I was 14. Mason didn't press for details. The set of her jaw told enough of the story. "This is different. A rifle has range, but it takes practice to be accurate." He demonstrated the proper stance, how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to sight along the barrel. Isabella watched intently, then took the rifle when offered. Her hands were steady, her movements careful, but not fearful. "Breathe out as you squeeze the trigger," Mason instructed. "Don't pull. Just squeeze like you're pressing a drop of water from a cloth." Isabella's first shot went wide, the recoil catching her by surprise. But she repositioned immediately, adjusted her stance without prompting, and tried again. The second shot clipped the edge of a can, sending it spinning. By the third shot, she was hitting targets consistently. Mason raised an eyebrow, impressed, despite himself. "You're a quick study." "I've always been a good student," Isabella replied, a hint of pride in her voice. "My mother insisted on education, even when others said it was wasted on a girl." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was." Isabella sighted on another target, squeezed the trigger. The can flew backward off the post. "She died when I was 16. Fever." The parallels to his own loss weren't lost on Mason. "I'm sorry." Isabella lowered the rifle, turning to face him. "My father was Spanish from Madrid originally. My mother was Mexican. They met in Sonora when he was traveling through. Scandalized both families by marrying." It was the most personal information she'd volunteered since arriving, and Mason recognized the offering for what it was, a small measure of trust. "How did you meet Mateo?" he asked, reloading the rifle. A smile touched Isabella's lips, transforming her face. "At the mission school in Santa Fe. I was teaching children to read. He was teaching mathematics and languages." Pride entered her voice. "Mateo was brilliant, the first Apache man to graduate from Harvard." "That couldn't have been easy. Nothing was ever easy for him. But he believed education was worth any hardship. That knowledge was the one thing no one could take from you." They continued practicing until the sun climbed high overhead. Isabella proved a natural markswoman, her focus and determination compensating for her lack of experience. As they walked back to the house, Gabriel's cries greeted them. Mason followed more slowly, struck by how quickly Isabella had adapted to life at the ranch, how naturally she moved through spaces that had stood empty for years. Inside, Isabella had settled in a rocking chair with Gabriel singing softly in Spanish as she nursed him. Mason busied himself at the stove, giving her privacy while preparing a simple lunch. "Your Spanish is beautiful," he commented when she joined him at the table. "My mother insisted we speak it at home, said our heritage was nothing to be ashamed of, even when others thought differently." "How did Mateo end up working for Hawkins?" Mason asked the question that had been troubling him. "A Harvard-educated man doesn't typically become a bookkeeper." Isabella's expression darkened. "The territorial governor cut funding for schools serving Native children, called it financial necessity. Within months, 20 schools closed, ours among them. And Hawkins offered him a position. Mateo had a family to support, a son on the way. Isabella looked down at Gabriel. He took what was available, though he hated working for a man like Hawkins. Said he could do more good from the inside, learning how Hawkins's operation worked. Until he discovered what that operation really was. Isabella nodded grimly. Human trafficking, children separated from parents, women sold to mining camps and worse. Her voice hardened. Mateo couldn't stand by once he knew. He started gathering evidence, making copies of records, lists of names. And Hawkins found out. Someone betrayed him. They came at night, took us both, made me watch while they— She broke off, composing herself with visible effort. She described Mateo's last hours in a voice stripped of emotion, as if distance alone made the telling bearable. How they'd questioned him about co-conspirators, about where he'd hidden evidence. How he'd refused to answer, protecting Isabella and others who'd helped him. The last thing he said to me was that I should find you. That Mason Redwood was a man who understood honor. The weight of Mateo's faith settled on Mason's shoulders like a physical burden. What had the man seen in their brief encounter that had inspired such confidence? "I'll do everything I can to keep you and Gabriel safe," he said, the only promise he felt capable of making. "But Isabella, you should know, I'm not the man your husband thought I was." Isabella studied him for a long moment. "Perhaps you're not the man you think you are either, Mr. Redwood." That afternoon, Mason rode to town for supplies, his mind churning with plans and contingencies. Silver Creek was bustling when he arrived, and he kept his interactions brief, collecting only essentials: flour, coffee, sugar, ammunition. As he paid, the shopkeeper leaned across the counter. "Heard you had some excitement out at your place during the dust storm." Mason kept his expression neutral. Nothing exciting about cleaning dust out of every corner for a week. "That's so." The shopkeeper glanced toward the door. "Because word is, there's a Mexican woman and baby gone missing from Santa Fe. Valuable property according to those looking for them." Ice formed in Mason's veins. "I wouldn't know anything about that." "Course not. Just thought you should know there's men asking questions, offering rewards." "Who's asking?" "Didn't catch the name. Well-dressed fellow, though. City man, not local." Mason nodded once. "Appreciate the information." Outside, Mason secured his purchases to the Saddle Mind Racing. If Hawkins's men were already in Silver Creek asking questions, their time was shorter than he'd hoped. The sheriff's office was empty, but Mason found Cooper at the town stables examining a chestnut mare. "Nathan," Mason greeted him. "Looking to buy—" Cooper straightened, a smile breaking through his serious expression. "Just admiring. Can't afford another mouth to feed on a lawman's salary." He studied Mason's face. "You're not here about horses, though. Walk with me." As they moved away from curious ears, Mason filled Cooper in on what the shopkeeper had said. The sheriff listened without interruption, his weathered face growing troubled. "I've heard rumors," Cooper admitted. "Man named Roland Hawkins, asking after a woman and child. Says they stole from him, but the story changes depending on who he's talking to." "He's lying," Mason said flatly. "Isabella Diaz and her son are under my protection. Her husband was murdered by Hawkins for discovering his involvement in human trafficking." Cooper's eyebrows rose. "That's a serious accusation, Mason. It's the truth. Truth's a luxury in these parts," Cooper sighed. "Hawkins has influence, money, friends in territorial government. And you're saying the law won't help. I'm saying the law has limits, especially when it comes to the word of a Mexican woman against a white businessman." Mason's jaw tightened. "So justice only applies to certain people? You know that's not how I operate." Cooper's voice hardened. "But I'm one man with a badge in a territory where money often speaks louder than right. They walked in silence for a moment. "There's something else you should know," Cooper said finally. "My son Caleb is working for Hawkins." Mason stopped short. "Caleb, I thought he was studying law back east. Came home 6 months ago. Said he needed practical experience before finishing his degree." Cooper's expression was pained. "Took a position as Hawkins's assistant. Says he's learning more about contract law and business in a month with Hawkins than he would in a year of school. Does he know what kind of man he's working for? That's just it, I'm not sure. Caleb's always been idealistic. If he discovered what Hawkins is really involved in—" Mason understood the fear Cooper couldn't voice. "You're worried Hawkins would silence him, like he did Mateo Diaz." Cooper nodded grimly. "Which puts me in a difficult position. I want to help Isabella and her child, but my son? What can you tell me about Hawkins's operation here? How many men? Where are they staying?" "Hawkins himself hasn't arrived yet, but he's sent 6 men ahead. They're staying at the Grand Hotel." Cooper hesitated. "They've been watching your ranch from the ridge to the east." Mason cursed under his breath. The ridge overlooked his property, offering a clear view of the house and barn. "How long?" 3 days at least. Which meant they'd seen him practicing with Isabella, teaching her to shoot. Knew she was there. "Mason," Cooper's hand landed on his shoulder. "Whatever you're planning, remember, they outnumber you. And Hawkins doesn't play by any rules you'd recognize. Neither do I. Not anymore." Mason's voice hardened. "I left that life behind, Nathan. Built something peaceful. But if Hawkins thinks he can threaten innocent people under my protection, he'll find out exactly what kind of man I was during the war." As Mason rode home, he spotted a lone rider on a black horse moving parallel to his path at a distance. When Mason altered his course slightly, the rider adjusted to match. Not bothering to hide their surveillance, a message: "We know where you are, where you're going." By the time Mason reached the ranch, afternoon was fading toward evening. Isabella met him at the door, one look at his face telling her something was wrong. "They know," she said, reading his expression. Mason nodded, unloading supplies with quick efficiency. "Hawkins's men are in town. They've been watching the ranch." Fear flashed across Isabella's features before being replaced by determination. "How long do we have?" "Not long. A day, maybe 2, before they make a move." Mason carried the supplies inside. "We need to be ready to leave quickly if necessary." "To leave for where?" Isabella asked, bouncing Gabriel gently as he fussed. "If they're watching the ranch." "I have an idea about that." Mason pulled out the kitchen chair for her. "But first, there's something I need to show you." He led her to the root cellar off the kitchen. At the back, behind stacked crates, Mason revealed a trap door set into the earthen floor. "What is this?" Isabella asked, shifting Gabriel to her other hip. "During the war, my father helped runaway slaves escape north and west." Mason lifted the trapdoor, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. This was part of the Underground Railroad, a secret passage that leads to a hidden room beneath the barn. Isabella's eyes widened. "Your father was an abolitionist, one of the first in these parts." Mason couldn't keep the pride from his voice. "Wasn't a popular position, but he believed all people deserved freedom." He lit a lantern and led Isabella down the stairs into a low-ceilinged tunnel, roughly hewn but structurally sound. The tunnel opened into a circular chamber about 12 feet across. Simple furnishings lined the walls: a narrow cot shelves with preserved food, a small stove with chimney disguised as part of the barn's ventilation system. "It hasn't been used in years," Mason said, "but it's still sound. If Hawkins's men come to the house, you and Gabriel can hide here." Isabella took in the space with a mixture of awe and apprehension. You've thought of everything. Not everything, Mason admitted, but it's a start. Tomorrow we'll stock it with fresh supplies. Make sure the stove still works. As they returned to the house, Mason felt the old wound in his side begin to throb, a souvenir from a Confederate bullet that still troubled him in times of stress. "You're hurt," Isabella observed as he pressed a hand against it. "Old injury," Mason dismissed. "Acts up sometimes." "Up. Let me see." Her tone brooked no argument. Reluctantly, Mason sat and allowed her to examine the wound, a puckered scar just below his ribs. As her fingers probed gently, he winced. "It's inflamed," she pronounced. "How long has it been bothering you?" Isabella moved to her belongings, extracting a small cloth bag of dried herbs. "Mateo's mother taught me," she explained. "Apache medicine, better than anything your doctor would prescribe." She boiled water, added the herbs, and created a poultice that she applied to Mason's side with practiced hands. The relief was almost immediate. "Thank you," Mason said, genuinely grateful. "Where did you learn to do that?" "I lived with Mateo's family for a time before Gabriel was born. His mother was a healer, said I had the gift for it if I would learn." As she worked, Mason found himself studying her face, the quiet concentration, the competence in her movements. In just a few weeks, Isabella had revealed depths he hadn't initially suspected. Teacher, healer, markswoman, survivor. "Isabella, about what I learned in town. There's more you should know." He told her about the watchers on the ridge, about Sheriff Cooper's son working for Hawkins, about the rewards being offered for information on her whereabouts. Isabella listened without interruption, her expression growing more resolved with each detail. When he finished, she looked down at Gabriel, now sleeping peacefully. "I won't run any more," she said finally, voice low but firm. "Mateo died standing up to Hawkins. I won't dishonor that by spending our lives looking over our shoulders. Standing and fighting are different propositions when the odds are 6-1, Mason pointed out. Then we change the odds. Isabella's gaze met his unwavering. "You were a scout, a fighter. Teach me what you know, and we find allies, people who would stand against Hawkins if they knew the truth." Mason considered her words. The strategist in him, dormant for 7 years, began to stir. "It won't be easy, and it will be dangerous." "Life is dangerous," Isabella countered, "especially for people like us, those without money or influence to protect them. But I want Gabriel to grow up in a world where men like Hawkins don't always win." Her determination kindled something in Mason he'd thought long extinguished. A willingness to fight, not just for survival, but for what was right. That evening, as the three of them sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of fire, Mason felt more at peace than he had in years. The silence between them was comfortable, undemanding. Then Gabriel laughed, a bright, bubbling sound of pure joy as Isabella bounced him gently on her knee. The unexpected sound pierced Mason's carefully constructed armor, finding the heart he'd thought long dead. And Mason Redwood, who hadn't smiled in 7 years, found the corners of his mouth turning upward in response. A week later, Gabriel fell ill. It began with fussiness, at breakfast progressed to a worrying lethargy by noon, and by evening had blossomed into a full fever that left the infant's skin burning to the touch. Isabella paced the kitchen, Gabriel wailing weakly against her shoulder as she tried every remedy she knew. Cool cloths, diluted goat's milk, gentle rocking. Nothing helped. The baby's cries grew more pitiful, his little body radiating heat, despite their efforts to cool him. The panic in Isabella's eyes struck a chord so deep in Mason that he moved without conscious thought. He knew that particular helplessness had worn it like a second skin as Rebecca faded before him. This time would be different. Without a word, he was out the door, his fastest stallion saddled and snorting white clouds in the evening chill. Hooves thundered against rocky paths that could snap a leg with one misstep, but caution belonged to men who hadn't already lost everything once. Silver Creek was quiet when he arrived, most businesses closed for the night. Mason pounded on the doctor's door until a disheveled Henry Wilson appeared, medical bag already in hand. "Who's dying, Redwood?" the doctor asked without preamble. "Baby, high fever. Can't keep anything down." Wilson's eyebrows rose. "Didn't know you had a child on that ranch of yours." "I don't. Visitors." Mason had no patience for explanations. "You coming or not?" The ride back took half the time, both men pushing their horses to the limit. At the ranch, Wilson examined the infant with gentle efficiency, his weathered face giving nothing away. "Looks like summer fever," he announced finally. "Been seeing it all over the county this month. Not dangerous if treated properly, but infants need careful watching." He left medicines and detailed instructions with Isabella. "Keep him cool. Make sure he takes fluids, even if just a few drops at a time. If he's not better by morning, send for me again." After the doctor departed, Mason and Isabella established a vigil in the kitchen, taking turns holding Gabriel, while the other caught moments of rest. The night stretched endlessly, marked by the baby's fretful cries and Isabella's soft Spanish lullabies. Near dawn, Gabriel's fever finally broke. The sudden transition from burning heat to clammy coolness alarmed Isabella until Mason assured her it was a good sign. "Rebecca had fevers as a child," he explained, wetting a fresh cloth for Gabriel's forehead. "Her mother told me the breaking of the fever often looks worse than the fever itself." Isabella studied him across the kitchen table, shadows beneath her eyes testifying to the night's ordeal. "You would have been a good father," she said quietly. The simple statement caught Mason off guard. We were going to have a child," he admitted. "Rebecca was 5 months along when she died." Isabella's expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. Some griefs don't recognize time." Isabella smoothed Gabriel's dark hair. "Mateo's been gone 3 weeks. But there are moments I turn to tell him something, and the shock of his absence feels brand new." Mason nodded, recognizing the sentiment. "Does it get easier?" "I'll let you know when I find out." Isabella's attempt at a smile didn't reach her eyes. "You've had 7 years. What do you think?" "Different, not easier," Mason answered honestly. "Like learning to walk with a missing limb. Eventually you adapt, but you never stop feeling the absence." They fell silent, the first pale light of dawn seeping through the windows. Gabriel slept peacefully now, his breathing regular color returning to his cheeks. "I should check the stock," Mason said, eventually rising. "Will you be all right?" Isabella nodded, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "I'll rest while he sleeps." Outside, the world was washed in the pearl-gray light of early morning. Mason went about his chores automatically, his mind still in the kitchen with Isabella and Gabriel. The night's shared vigil had created a new intimacy between them. Not romantic, but the deeper connection forged through common purpose and concern. When Mason returned mid-morning, he found Isabella asleep in the rocking chair, Gabriel cradled against her chest. Both slept deeply, faces relaxed in identical expressions of peace. Something twisted in Mason's chest at the sight. A bittersweet ache that was part longing, part protective instinct. That evening, after Gabriel was settled for the night, Isabella joined Mason on the porch. The late summer evening was mild stars emerging in a sky still faintly colored by sunset. "I thought I was going to lose him," Isabella said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. When his fever wouldn't break, I've never been so frightened. But you didn't, Mason reminded her. He's strong like his mother. Isabella glanced at him, a smile touching her lips. And stubborn like his father. She looked out at the darkening landscape. Mateo used to say our son would have the best and worst of both of us. What were the worst parts, according to Mateo? My temper. His pride. Isabella's smile widened briefly before fading. He worried about the world Gabriel would grow up in. Whether there would be a place for a child who was neither fully Apache nor fully Mexican nor fully Spanish. There's a place, Mason said with more certainty than he felt. Maybe not an easy one, but a place nonetheless. And Gabriel will have you to help him find it. They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness settled over the ranch. Crickets began their nightly chorus, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. I've been thinking, Isabella said finally. We can't stay here indefinitely. Hawkins will find us eventually. You're welcome as long as you need, Mason replied, surprised by how much he meant it. Both of you. That's generous, but it's not fair to bring danger to your door. You've already done more than most would. I made a promise to help you, Mason reminded her. I intend to keep it. Isabella turned to face him fully. Why, and don't say because you owed Mateo a life. There's more to it than that. The directness of the question deserved an honest answer. Mason considered his words carefully. For 7 years, I've been half alive, going through the motions without purpose. When you and Gabriel arrived, it reminded me there's still good worth protecting in this world. The admission felt like opening a long, sealed door, letting fresh air into a musty room. Isabella's expression softened, and for a moment, Mason thought she might reach for his hand. Instead, she looked back toward the stars. I used to dream of opening my own school someday, she said, changing the subject. A place where any child could learn regardless of background or circumstances. Sounds like a worthy dream. Mateo and I planned it together. We'd even started saving. Her voice caught. Now I wonder if any dream is possible with Hawkins out there searching for us. Men like Hawkins aren't invincible, Mason said, an edge entering his voice. They just want everyone to believe they are. Isabella's hand found his in the darkness, her touch light but firm. It was the first time she'd initiated physical contact between them, and the simple gesture carried a weight of trust that humbled Mason. Thank you, she said simply. They sat in silence as the night deepened around them, hands still joined. Above them, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the human concerns below. But in that moment of connection, Mason Redwood felt more present, more alive than he had in 7 years. 2 days after Gabriel's recovery, Mason discovered something in the barn that sent a chill down his spine. Fresh cigarette butts behind the hay bales, still carrying the faint scent of tobacco. Someone had been inside the barn watching the house, perhaps, while they'd been focused on Gabriel's illness. Mason didn't tell Isabella immediately, not wanting to add to her worries. Instead, he quietly reinforced the locks on the doors and windows, kept his rifle closer at hand, and began taking irregular paths when checking the property's perimeter. On the third morning, while Isabella was bathing, Gabriel Mason went to the locked storeroom at the back of the house. He hadn't opened it in years, had avoided even looking at the door. Inside were the remnants of his life during the war. Maps, weapons, the tools of a scout who specialized in moving unseen through enemy territory. The key turned stiffly in the lock. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light from the doorway as Mason stepped inside. Everything remained as he'd left it. A trunk of equipment, a wall rack holding 3 rifles, and a brace of pistols, shelves of ammunition and supplies. The tools of a life he'd walked away from, but never truly escaped. Mason opened the trunk, past hesitations falling away in the face of present danger. Beneath oiled canvas lay his old scout gear, a spyglass compass, skinning knives wire for snares, and his most prized possession, a Sharps rifle, the most accurate long-distance weapon of its day. He was checking the rifle's action when Isabella's voice came from behind him. "I didn't know this room was here," she said. Gabriel propped on her hip. Mason turned. "Didn't seem relevant until now." Isabella took in the arsenal with widening eyes. "You were more than just a scout, weren't you?" "I was what the army needed me to be." Mason's voice was flat. "Sometimes that meant finding paths through Apache territory. Sometimes it meant other things." Isabella stepped closer, examining the weapons with more knowledge than Mason expected. "Mateo told me stories of special units during the war, men who operated behind enemy lines doing work regular soldiers couldn't or wouldn't." Mason didn't confirm or deny, but his silence was answer enough. "That's why Hawkins valued you," Isabella continued, "and why he didn't want you walking away with what you knew. It was a different time, a different life." Mason wrapped the Sharps rifle in cloth. "One I thought I'd left behind." Isabella's hand touched his arm lightly. "The past has a way of finding us, no matter how far we run." "Speaking of which," Mason said, changing the subject, "I found cigarette butts in the barn this morning. Someone's been watching the house." Isabella's hold on Gabriel tightened. "Hawkins's men, most likely, which means we don't have much time." Mason loaded several weapons and extra ammunition into a canvas bag. "We need to finish preparing the hiding place under the barn. Today." They spent the afternoon reinforcing the underground room, stocking it with food, water, blankets, and other essentials. Mason showed Isabella how to operate the hidden mechanisms that locked the trapdoor from inside, how to use the small ventilation system where the emergency exit led, a narrow tunnel that emerged in a dry creek bed a quarter-mile from the house. "If anything happens to me," Mason instructed, "take Gabriel and go through the creek bed. Follow it west for 5 miles until you reach the mission. Ask for Father Miguel. He was a friend of my father's. He'll help you." Isabella listened intently, memorizing every detail, but shook her head at his final words. "Nothing's going to happen to you, Isabella." Mason's voice was gentle but firm. "We need to be realistic. Hawkins won't come alone, and he won't take rejection lightly." Before she could respond, a sound from above made them both freeze, the distant but unmistakable rhythm of approaching horses. "It's too early," Isabella whispered, clutching Gabriel closer. "You said we'd have more time." "Stay here," Mason ordered, already moving toward the ladder that led back to the barn. "Lock the trapdoor behind me. Don't open it unless you hear my voice." "Mason," Isabella caught his arm. "Be careful." Their eyes held for a moment volumes of unspoken words passing between them. Then Mason nodded once and climbed swiftly up the ladder. Isabella secured the trapdoor as instructed, the mechanism sliding into place with a soft click that sealed her and Gabriel in darkness, broken only by the small lantern they'd brought. Above, Mason moved silently through the barn to a small window that offered a view of the approaching riders. His breath caught as he counted the figures, not Hawkins's men, but Sheriff Cooper alone, except for a young man riding beside him, who Mason recognized as Cooper's son, Caleb. Mason let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Grabbing his rifle from where he'd stashed it, he moved out of the barn and into the yard, keeping the weapon visible, but pointed down. "Nathan," he called as the riders approached. "Wasn't expecting company." Cooper reined in his horse, his expression grave. "Mason, we need to talk." The sheriff dismounted, followed by Caleb. The young man had grown since Mason had last seen him, taller now than his father, with the same serious eyes, but a leaner, more scholarly build. He moved with obvious discomfort in the saddle, a man who spent more time with books than horses. "Inside," Mason offered, gesturing toward the house. Cooper nodded, and the three men moved toward the porch. Once inside, Mason set coffee to boil the routine, giving him time to assess the situation. Cooper was tense, his normal easy manner replaced by something more brittle. Caleb looked nervous, constantly glancing toward the windows. "Hawkins is coming," Cooper said without preamble once they were seated at the kitchen table. "Tomorrow, maybe the next day. With at least 10 men. Mason's hand stilled on his coffee cup. "How do you know?" "I told him." Caleb spoke up, his voice steadier than his expression. "I've been working in Hawkins's office for the past 6 months, keeping track of his operations." And Mason's gaze shifted to Cooper, who nodded confirmation. "Caleb came to me 3 months ago with concerns about Hawkins's business practices. We decided he should stay in position, gather evidence." "And what evidence have you gathered?" Mason asked, addressing Caleb directly. The young man reached into his jacket, withdrawing a small leather-bound journal. "Enough to hang him twice over. Trafficking operations, bribes to officials, 3 murders I know of personally." He set the journal on the table, including that of Mateo Diaz. Mason didn't touch the journal. "Why bring this to me? Why not the territorial marshal?" "Because Hawkins has the marshal in his pocket," Cooper said grimly. "And most of the local judges. We need federal intervention, but that takes time we don't have. And because I found this," Caleb added, pulling out a folded paper, "in Hawkins's private files." Mason unfolded the paper, a wanted notice with his own face staring back at him, dated 7 years earlier. The charges: desertion, theft of military property, and murder. "It's fake," Cooper said quickly, "but Hawkins has been holding on to it, waiting for the right moment to use it against you." "Why now?" Mason asked, though he already knew the answer. "Because of Isabella Diaz and her son," Caleb replied. "Hawkins is obsessed with finding them. When he heard rumors they might be here, he found his excuse to come after you legally," Cooper finished. "With that warrant, fake or not, he can bring men onto your property, search everything, take you into custody." Mason absorbed this information, mind racing through options. "How much time do we have?" "A day at most," Caleb said. "He was finalizing plans when I left Santa Fe, gathering men." Cooper leaned forward. "Mason, where are they, Isabella and the child?" For a long moment Mason said nothing, weighing his trust in Cooper against decades of ingrained caution. Finally he stood. "Come with me." He led them to the barn and the hidden trapdoor. "Isabella," he called down. "It's safe. Sheriff Cooper is here with his son." The mechanism clicked, and the trapdoor lifted slightly. Mason pulled it fully open, revealing Isabella's wary face, peering up from below, Gabriel silent in her arms. "It's all right," Mason assured her. "They're here to help." Isabella climbed up her posture, tense eyes fixed on the strangers. Mason made quick introductions, explaining Caleb's position and what they'd learned about Hawkins's imminent arrival. "He won't stop," Isabella said quietly, after hearing everything. "Not until he has Gabriel and the mine." "Or until he's stopped permanently," Mason replied, his voice hardening. "There's another option," Caleb spoke up. "My evidence combined with Mrs. Diaz's testimony and the documents Mateo Diaz concealed before his death would be enough for federal prosecution." Isabella's head snapped up. "What documents?" Caleb looked surprised. "The copies of Hawkins's records, ledgers, contracts, correspondence. Mateo hid them before his death." "I don't know anything about hidden documents," Isabella said, confusion evident in her voice. Mateo never told me where he kept his evidence. An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. If Mateo's evidence couldn't be found, their case against Hawkins weakened significantly. "We need to think," Cooper said finally. "Mason, your place isn't safe anymore. Even if we hide Isabella and the baby, Hawkins has legal cover to tear this ranch apart." Mason nodded grimly. "I know a place. An old line shack in the foothills about 15 miles northeast. It's not comfortable, but it's defensible and hidden." "We could split up," Cooper suggested. "Caleb can take Isabella and the child to Santa Fe to the federal marshal's office there." Isabella shook her head firmly. "I won't run and leave Mason to face Hawkins alone." "And I won't put Gabriel at risk on the open road," Mason added. "Not when Hawkins has men watching every trail out of Silver Creek." They debated options for another hour, finally settling on a plan. Mason, Isabella, and Gabriel would move to the line shack that night. Cooper would return to town, maintaining a pretense of normal operations while quietly reaching out to a federal judge he trusted. Caleb would continue his deception, returning to Hawkins's side to monitor the situation from within. "It's not ideal," Cooper admitted as they prepared to leave, "but it buys us time." As the sheriff and his son mounted up, Caleb turned back to Isabella. "Mrs. Diaz, did your husband have any special hiding places? Anywhere he might have concealed important documents?" Isabella thought for a moment. "There was a silver cross he always wore. It was hollow inside. He kept a small key in it. But Hawkins's men took it from his body." Caleb nodded thoughtfully. "I'll look into it. The cross might still be among his effects in Hawkins's office." After Cooper and Caleb departed, Mason and Isabella worked quickly, packing only essentials for their journey to the line shack. They would travel at night using Mason's knowledge of the terrain to avoid the main trails where Hawkins's men might be watching. As darkness fell, Mason saddled 2 horses, his sorrel gelding, and a gentle mare that could carry Isabella and Gabriel. He fashioned a secure sling for the baby, showing Isabella how to position Gabriel against her body for maximum safety during the ride. "Are you sure about this?" Isabella asked, as they prepared to leave, her expression troubled in the faint light from the barn lantern. "You've already risked so much for us." "I made my choice the moment you arrived," Mason replied simply. "Besides, this isn't just about you and Gabriel anymore. Hawkins and I have unfinished business." Isabella studied his face in the dim light. "Revenge won't bring Rebecca back, Mason." "This isn't about revenge." But even as he said it, Mason knew it wasn't entirely true. "It's about justice. For Mateo, for all the others Hawkins has hurt." Isabella's hand found his in the darkness, squeezing gently. "Just promise me something." "What's that?" "That whatever happens, you won't lose yourself in the process. The man you are now, the one who saved us, who cares for Gabriel, who built this place as an act of hope despite everything, that man is worth preserving." Mason had no response to that, but he returned the pressure of her hand before turning to secure the last of their provisions. 20 minutes later, they rode away from the ranch, 3 shadows moving through the New Mexico night toward an uncertain future. The line shack stood in a small clearing backed against a rocky hillside, nearly invisible until they were upon it. Mason had built it years earlier as a shelter for when he worked the northern pastures. A simple one-room structure with a stone fireplace, sturdy walls, and a single window that could be secured with wooden shutters. They arrived just before dawn, having taken a circuitous route that added miles, but avoided open country where they might be spotted. Gabriel had remained remarkably quiet throughout the journey, as if the infant sensed the need for silence. "It's not much," Mason apologized as he helped Isabella dismount, taking Gabriel so she could stretch her stiff limbs. "But it's solid, and few people know it exists." "It's perfect," Isabella assured him, surveying the defensive position with knowing eyes. The shack's placement against the hillside eliminated one avenue of approach, while the clearing provided clear sight lines in all other directions. Anyone coming would be visible long before they reached the cabin. Inside, Mason lit a small fire in the stone hearth, keeping it minimal to avoid excessive smoke that might give away their position. The interior was spare, but functional. A narrow cot, a rough-hewn table with 2 stools, shelves stocked with basic provisions, and a small barrel of fresh water in the corner. "You keep this place prepared," Isabella observed, noting the ready supplies. Mason nodded. "Old habits. Always have a fallback position." They settled in as comfortably as possible, establishing a new routine in their temporary refuge. During the day, Mason scouted the surrounding area, familiarizing Isabella with escape routes and hiding places should they become separated. At night, they took turns standing watch, though Mason insisted on taking the longer shifts, allowing Isabella more rest. On the 3rd day, as Mason returned from checking his perimeter traps, he found Isabella sitting outside the cabin, Gabriel asleep in her arms, her expression distant. "Something wrong?" he asked, setting down his rifle. Isabella looked up, seeming to return from far away. "I was thinking about Mateo's documents. If we could find them." "Caleb's looking," Mason reminded her, settling beside her on the rough-hewn bench. "It's not just that." Isabella shifted Gabriel to her other arm. "There was something Mateo said the night before they came for us. Something that didn't make sense then." Mason waited, letting her work through the memory at her own pace. He said, "The truth is in the heart of the Silver Virgin," Isabella continued. "I thought he was delirious with fear, but now I wonder if he was trying to tell me something." "The Silver Virgin," Mason repeated. "Could be a location, or a code of some kind. Or both." Isabella's eyes lit with sudden clarity. "The mission in Silver Creek. There's a silver statue of the Virgin Mary in the sanctuary. Mateo used to pray there sometimes." Mason considered this. "It's possible. Churches have always been good hiding places for those seeking sanctuary." He paused, reluctant to dash her hopes. "But Silver Creek is exactly where Hawkins will be looking for us." "Which might make it the last place he'd expect us to go," Isabella countered. "Besides, we don't both have to go. I could describe the statue where to look." "No." Mason's response was immediate and firm. "We don't separate. That's how people get picked off, one by one." Isabella opened her mouth to argue, then closed it as a distant sound reached them. The faint but unmistakable rhythm of approaching horses. Mason was on his feet in an instant, motioning Isabella toward the cabin. Inside, "Take Gabriel to the root cellar." The small cellar beneath the cabin floor had been their emergency hiding place since arriving, just large enough for Isabella and Gabriel to conceal themselves if necessary. Mason had shown her how to secure it from inside, how to remain absolutely still and silent. Isabella moved swiftly, disappearing into the cabin with 6-month-old Gabriel secure against her. Mason took position behind a large boulder at the edge of the clearing, his Sharps rifle ready. Through the spyglass, he counted 3 riders approaching from the west, not from the direction of Silver Creek, but from the high country beyond. As they drew closer, Mason relaxed slightly. Not Hawkins's men, but a hunting party. 2 Mexicans and an older white man, their horses laden with recent kills, likely heading back to one of the small settlements in the valley. Still, Mason remained hidden until they had passed well beyond the clearing, their voices fading into the distance. Only when he was certain they were gone did he return to the cabin. "Just hunters," he reported, helping Isabella up from the cellar, Gabriel still sleeping peacefully in her arms. "But it means we need to be more careful. This area isn't as isolated as I'd hoped." Isabella nodded, her expression troubled. Mason, we can't stay here indefinitely. Supplies will run low eventually, and Gabriel needs more than this. She gestured at their sparse surroundings. I know. Mason ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in the gesture. Cooper was supposed to send word by now. As if summoned by his words, a sharp whistle sounded from the trees east of the cabin. 3 short bursts, followed by 1 long. The signal Cooper had established. Mason moved to the door, rifle ready. Stay inside, he instructed Isabella, just in case. He stepped outside, scanning the tree line until he spotted movement. A single rider moving slowly into the clearing with hands visibly raised to show peaceful intentions. It was Caleb Cooper, his horse lathered from hard riding. Redwood, the young man called. It's me. Mason lowered his rifle slightly but remained wary. Approach slowly. Caleb complied, dismounting at the edge of the clearing and leading his horse the rest of the way. Up close, Mason could see the exhaustion etched in his features, the grime of hard travel on his clothing. Inside, Mason directed, gesturing toward the cabin. You look like you could use some coffee. Once inside, with Isabella and Gabriel joining them at the small table, Caleb gratefully accepted the steaming mug Mason offered. Hawkins knows, he said without preamble after the first sip. About me, sir, about what I've been gathering. Isabella gasped softly. How? I got careless. Self-recrimination filled Caleb's voice. He caught me copying documents from his safe. I barely got away. He reached inside his jacket, withdrawing a small oilskin packet. But I got what we needed. Mason took the packet, opening it carefully. Inside were several pages of ledgers, contracts with names and figures clearly visible, and most damning of all, a list of merchandise that could only be human beings, complete with prices and destinations. This is enough to hang him, Mason said, leafing through the documents. There's more. Caleb turned to Isabella. I found your husband's cross. The key inside led to a strongbox hidden in the mission church, just as you suspected. He produced a small silver cross from his pocket, passing it reverently to Isabella. The priest had been keeping it safe all this time, not knowing what it opened. Isabella's fingers closed around the cross, tears welling in her eyes. And the documents, safe with my father. Combined with what I've gathered, it's more than enough evidence for the federal authorities. Then why are you here instead of with the marshals? Mason asked the strategist in him, sensing the missing piece. Caleb's expression darkened. Because Hawkins figured it out too. He sent men to Silver Creek yesterday. They've taken my father into custody. Isabella's hand flew to her mouth. On what charges? Interfering with a federal investigation, Caleb replied bitterly. Hawkins convinced Judge Palmer to issue a warrant claiming my father was obstructing justice in the matter of Mateo Diaz's murder. That's backward, Isabella protested. Hawkins is the murderer. It's a common tactic, Mason said grimly. Accuse your enemies of your own crimes. Creates confusion, buys time. He turned to Caleb. Where are they holding your father? The jail in Silver Creek, ironically enough. His own jail. Caleb's voice tightened with anger. Hawkins plans to transfer him to Santa Fe tomorrow, where Judge Palmer will ensure he never receives a fair hearing. Mason was already calculating distances, timing options. Then we have until tomorrow to free him. You can't be serious, Isabella said, though her expression suggested she'd expected nothing less. Silver Creek will be crawling with Hawkins's men. Which is why they won't expect us, Mason replied. They think we're running hiding, not mounting a rescue operation in the heart of their territory. Caleb leaned forward, hope kindling in his eyes. You have a plan, the beginnings of one. Mason spread the documents on the table using them as an impromptu map of Silver Creek. But it's going to take all of us, and it's going to be dangerous. Isabella glanced down at Gabriel sleeping peacefully in her arms, then back to Mason. Her jaw set with determination. Tell us what to do. For the next hour, the three of them huddled around the table, voices low, as Mason outlined his strategy. It was audacious, dependent on precise timing and a certain amount of luck. But as Mason reminded them, sometimes the boldest plan was the safest, simply because no one would expect it. As night fell, they made their final preparations. Mason cleaned and loaded every weapon, while Isabella packed what they would need for Gabriel. Caleb studied the town layout Mason had sketched, memorizing approach routes and rendezvous points. Try to get some rest, Mason advised as they finished. We leave 2 hours before dawn. Isabella put Gabriel down in the small pallet they'd made for him, then turned to Mason. Can I speak with you outside? In the cool night air, with stars wheeling overhead, Isabella stood close enough that Mason could see the moonlight reflected in her dark eyes. For a long moment, she said nothing, as if gathering her thoughts or her courage. If something happens tomorrow, she began finally, her voice soft but steady. I want you to know that these past weeks, despite everything, have been a gift. Her hand found his in the darkness. You gave Gabriel and me a home when we had none, safety when we were in danger. Isabella, Mason started, but she shook her head. Let me finish, please. She took a deep breath. I know you still love Rebecca. I know that grief like that never fully heals. But I've seen how you look at Gabriel, how you've started to live again since we arrived. Mason stood very still, unable to deny the truth in her words. Whatever happens tomorrow, Isabella continued, her voice dropping almost to a whisper. Remember that you deserve a future Mason Redwood, one with joy in it, not just duty and old ghosts. Before he could respond, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his, a kiss as gentle as it was unexpected. Then she stepped back, gave his hand one final squeeze, and returned to the cabin, leaving Mason standing alone beneath the vast New Mexico sky, touched for the first time in 7 years by something that felt dangerously like hope. They left the line shack in the darkest hour before dawn, when even nocturnal creatures had fallen silent. Isabella rode with Gabriel secured against her in the sling Mason had fashioned, the baby mercifully quiet, as if sensing the gravity of their journey. Caleb and Mason flanked her, all three, moving with the stealth that comes from knowing lives depend on silence. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. While Hawkins's men would be watching the roads and the ranch, they would enter Silver Creek from the west, through the creek bed that gave the town its name. A route rarely used due to its difficult terrain, but one Mason knew intimately from his scouting days. They would split up once they reached town, Caleb to the church to meet with Father Miguel, who would help secure the last of Mateo's evidence. Isabella and Gabriel to the doctor's house, where they would take refuge, while Mason freed Sheriff Cooper from the jail. If all went according to plan, they would rendezvous at the church by noon, where the priest would hide them until the federal marshal could be summoned from Santa Fe with the combined evidence against Hawkins. It was a plan with a dozen points of potential failure, but none of them spoke of that as they rode through the pre-dawn darkness, each lost in private thoughts of what the coming day might bring. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when they reached the creek bed a mile west of town. Here they dismounted, secured the horses in a small grove of cottonwoods, and continued on foot, moving single file through the shallow water to minimize tracks and scent. Silver Creek was stirring as they reached its outskirts. Smoke rising from chimneys, the distant sounds of livestock being tended, a dog barking somewhere near the center of town. They paused in the shadow of an abandoned mill at the western edge, surveying what they could see of the main street. "Hawkins's men will be watching the jail," Mason whispered, adjusting the rifle slung across his back. "At least 2, probably more, inside with Cooper." "The church is 3 blocks east," Caleb added, pointing. "I can make it there without being seen if I use the alleyways." Isabella clutched Gabriel closer, her face pale but determined in the growing light. "The doctor's house is on the north side. I remember passing it when we first arrived." Mason nodded. "Remember, no matter what happens, stick to the plan. If any of us don't make the rendezvous by noon, the others continue without them. Getting Cooper free and the evidence to the federal authorities is what matters." His eyes held Isabella's for a long moment, both aware he was really saying, "If I don't make it, save yourself and Gabriel." "We'll see you at the church," Isabella said firmly, refusing to acknowledge the possibility of failure. She turned to Caleb. "Be careful." "You too, Mrs. Diaz." With a final nod to Mason, Caleb slipped away, moving smoothly between buildings as he made his way east. Isabella remained a moment longer, Gabriel stirring against her chest. "Mason," she began, then seemed to think better of whatever she had been about to say. Instead, she reached up with her free hand, touching his face briefly. "Until noon." Then she too was gone, moving north toward the doctor's house. With the stealth of someone who had learned the hard way how to move unnoticed through hostile territory. Alone now, Mason took a deep breath, centering himself as he had before countless missions during the war. The familiar calm settled over him, not fearlessness, but a clarity that came from accepting whatever might come and focusing solely on the task at hand. The jail sat at the center of town, a squat adobe building with barred windows and a hitching post out front where 3 horses were already tethered, Hawkins's men no doubt standing guard over their prisoner. Mason observed for several minutes from the shadow of the mercantile, noting the patterns of movement, the positions of the visible guards. 2 men outside, at least 1 inside with Cooper. Possibly more he couldn't see from this position. The odds weren't good, but he'd faced worse during the war. Mason circled behind the buildings, working his way toward the rear of the jail, where a small window provided ventilation for the cells. If Cooper was being held in the back, as Mason suspected, this might offer a means of communication. Staying low, Mason crept to the window, listening for voices inside. He heard nothing at first, then a low groan followed by the sound of someone spitting. Cooper's voice strained but defiant. "That, all you got, Jenkins. My wife hits harder than that." A dull thud followed by another groan. Mason's jaw tightened. They were beating Cooper, likely trying to get information about Caleb's whereabouts, or the evidence he'd gathered. Mason needed a diversion, something to draw the guards outside while he dealt with whoever remained inside. As if in answer to his unspoken prayer, a commotion erupted at the far end of the street. Shouts, the crash of breaking glass, the thunder of running feet. Mason risked a glance around the corner of the jail. The 2 guards outside were moving toward the disturbance, hands on their weapons. Whatever was happening, it had captured their full attention. This was his chance. Mason moved swiftly to the front of the jail, entering with his rifle ready. Inside, a single guard stood over Cooper, who was bound to a chair, face bloodied, but eyes alert. The guard turned at Mason's entrance, reaching for his pistol, but froze at the sight of the rifle aimed at his chest. "Hands up," Mason ordered quietly. Nice and slow. The guard, Jenkins, Mason presumed, raised his hands reluctantly. "You're making a mistake, Redwood. Hawkins will—" "Hawkins isn't here," Mason interrupted, "but I am. On your knees, hands behind your head. Once the guard complied, Mason quickly tied and gagged him with strips torn from his own bandana. He then turned to Cooper, cutting the ropes that bound him to the chair. "Took you long enough," the sheriff managed, through split lips, his attempt at humor belied by the pain in his eyes. "Had to wait for an invitation," Mason replied, helping Cooper to his feet. "Can you walk?" Cooper nodded, though he swayed slightly. "Just give me a gun and point me in the right direction." Mason handed him the guard's revolver. "Church, Father Miguel's expecting us." "Caleb?" Cooper asked, concern evident despite his injuries. "Already there if all's gone according to plan." Mason checked the street through the window. The commotion had died down, but there was no sign of the guards returning yet. "We need to move. Now." They slipped out the back door, Mason supporting Cooper, as they made their way through back alleys toward the church. They had covered half the distance when shouting erupted from the direction of the jail. The guard had been discovered or the escape noticed. "Move faster," Mason urged, practically carrying Cooper now as the sheriff's strength began to flag. "We're almost there." The church's back door stood ajar when they reached it, just as planned. Inside, Father Miguel ushered them quickly to a small chamber off the sacristy where Caleb waited anxiously. "Father," Caleb rushed forward to help support Cooper. "What did they do to you?" "Nothing that won't heal," Cooper assured his son, though his grimace as they lowered him onto a narrow cot suggested otherwise. Father Miguel, a weathered man in his 60s with kind eyes and capable hands, immediately began tending to Cooper's injuries. "The woman and child," he asked Mason. "Should be at the doctor's," Mason replied, moving to the small window that overlooked the street. "Wilson will bring them here once he's sure it's safe." But as he spoke, commotion erupted outside. Shouts, the pounding of feet on packed earth, the unmistakable sound of Hawkins's men organizing a search. "They're going door to door," Caleb reported, joining Mason at the window. "They must know we're all in town." Mason's heart constricted. Isabella and Gabriel were supposed to be safe at the doctor's house, but if Hawkins's men were searching every building— "I have to go," he said, already moving toward the door. "Father, keep them here. No matter what happens, get that evidence to the federal marshal." Caleb caught his arm. "You can't go out there alone. There are at least a dozen of Hawkins's men in town now." "I'm not leaving Isabella and Gabriel to face them," Mason replied, his tone brooking no argument. "You have your duty, I have mine." Cooper struggled to sit up. "Mason, wait. There's something you should know about Hawkins." Mason paused, hand on the door. "What? He didn't just hire men to watch your ranch all these years," Cooper said, his voice strained. "He was obsessed with you, kept track of your movements, your business dealings. It wasn't just about the evidence you had against him." "What are you saying, Nathan?" Cooper met his gaze directly. "I'm saying Hawkins believes you took something that belonged to him, something personal, and he's never stopped looking for it." Before Mason could respond, the church door burst open. Dr. Wilson staggered in his face, ashen. "They've found them," he gasped. "Isabella and the baby. Hawkins has them." Mason's world narrowed to a single focused point. "Where?" "Main Street," Wilson replied. "In front of the hotel. Hawkins himself just rode in. He's calling for you, Redwood. Says if you don't show yourself, he'll—" The doctor broke off, unable to finish the sentence. Mason checked his weapons with mechanical precision, mind already calculating angles, distances, possibilities. "How many men with him?" "At least 10 that I could see," Wilson answered. "All armed, impossible odds. A suicidal mission." But Mason didn't hesitate. "I'm going out there." "Not alone," Caleb said, firmly checking his own pistol. "You'll both be killed," Cooper protested from the cot. Mason looked at the injured sheriff, then at Caleb, then at Father Miguel, who stood silent but resolute beside them. 4 men against Hawkins' small army. Desperate odds, but not hopeless. "We need a plan," Mason said finally, "and we need it fast." Outside in the growing heat of the New Mexico morning, Roland Hawkins stood in the dusty main street, Isabella and Gabriel held at gunpoint beside him. His voice carried clearly in the still air as he called Mason Redwood's name, demanding he surrender himself. And in the small chamber behind the church, 4 men huddled together, voices low and urgent, as they prepared to challenge a monster who had evaded justice for far too long. The final confrontation was about to begin. Mason moved to the window, peering carefully around the edge of the curtain. The scene in the street below sent ice through his veins. Roland Hawkins stood in the center of the dusty thoroughfare, Isabella and Gabriel held at gunpoint beside him. Even from this distance, Mason could see the rigid set of Isabella's spine as she clutched Gabriel to her chest, the infant mercifully quiet. Surrounding them were at least 10 armed men positioned strategically around the street. "Mason Redwood!" Hawkins's voice rang out, carrying easily in the still morning air. "I know you can hear me. Show yourself, or the woman and child pay the price for your cowardice." Mason's hand tightened on his rifle. 7 years had passed since he'd last seen Roland Hawkins, but the man hadn't changed much. Tall and imposing in an expensive black suit, silver streaking his dark hair at the temples, he carried himself with the same military bearing that had once commanded respect from his men. But the face that had once merely hinted at cruelty now openly displayed it, years of unchecked power, having stripped away any pretense of humanity. "I need a clear shot," Mason muttered, calculating angles and distances. "From the church bell tower, maybe." "You'll never get close enough," Cooper said from the cot, his voice strained with pain. "Even if you take Hawkins down, his men will cut you to pieces. And Isabella and the baby with you." "Then what do you suggest?" Mason demanded, frustration edging his voice. "I'm not leaving them out there." "We need leverage," Caleb interjected, his analytical mind working through the problem. "Something Hawkins wants more than revenge." Father Miguel, who had been silently tending to Cooper's wounds, spoke up. "The evidence. Hawkins must know by now that we have it. That's why he's so desperate to find all of you." Mason turned from the window, a plan beginning to form. "Hawkins doesn't know exactly what evidence we have or how much. He's guessing, playing his hand blind." Cooper nodded slowly, understanding dawning. "We can bluff. Make him think surrendering is his only option." "Not a bluff," Caleb corrected, reaching into his jacket to withdraw the oilskin packet. "We have enough here to hang him 10 times over. The question is, how to use it to our advantage." Mason's gaze returned to the window where Hawkins continued to call for him, his voice growing more threatening with each passing minute. Isabella stood motionless beside him, her eyes scanning the surrounding buildings as if searching for some sign of rescue. Mason knew that look. She wasn't panicking, she was calculating, waiting for her moment, just as he'd taught her. "I need to draw his attention," Mason said finally, the outline of a plan solidifying in his mind. "Get him focused on me, not on Isabella and the baby." "And then what?" Caleb asked. "Then we show him what we have," Mason replied, nodding toward the evidence packet. "Make it clear that killing us won't save him, that his only chance is surrender." "He'll never surrender," Cooper warned. "Not willingly." "No," Mason agreed. "But I don't need him to surrender. I just need him distracted long enough for Isabella to get clear with Gabriel." The plan came together quickly after that, each man contributing elements based on his particular knowledge and skills. Father Miguel knew of a passage beneath the church that emerged behind the hotel, allowing Caleb to position himself with the evidence without being seen. Cooper, despite his injuries, insisted on taking part, arguing that his badge still carried authority even if Hawkins's men temporarily controlled the town. Mason's role was the most dangerous, to face Hawkins directly alone and apparently unarmed, buying time for the others to move into position. "Give me 10 minutes," Caleb said, checking his pocket watch. "Then make your appearance." Mason nodded, his expression grim as he handed over his rifle and pistol to Father Miguel for safekeeping, keeping only a small derringer hidden in his boot. "Remember, Isabella and Gabriel are the priority. No matter what happens to me, get them to safety." The three men exchanged solemn looks, understanding the gravity of what they were about to attempt. Then Caleb and Father Miguel slipped out through the back of the church, leaving Mason alone with the injured sheriff. "He'll kill you on sight," Cooper warned, struggling to sit up despite his wounds. "You know that." "Maybe," Mason conceded, checking the small derringer one last time. "But Hawkins has always had a weakness. He likes an audience. He'll want to gloat, make an example of me. That gives us a chance." Cooper studied his friend's face, seeing the cold determination there. "This is about more than just Isabella and Gabriel, isn't it? This is about Rebecca, too." Mason was silent for a long moment. "Hawkins took Rebecca from me as surely as if he'd pulled the trigger himself," he said finally, his voice low. "But this isn't about revenge, Nathan. It's about making sure he never hurts anyone else." The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. Through the window, Mason could see Isabella still standing rigidly beside Hawkins, her face pale but composed. Gabriel had begun to fuss, small sounds of distress that carried faintly on the still air. "Time," Cooper said, checking his watch. "Caleb should be in position." Mason took a deep breath, centering himself, as he had countless times before dangerous missions. The familiar calm settled over him. Not fearlessness, but the clarity that came from absolute focus. "Whatever happens," he told Cooper, moving toward the door, "make sure Isabella and Gabriel get to Santa Fe. Make sure they're safe." Cooper nodded once, the gesture both a promise and a farewell. "Godspeed, Mason." Mason slipped out the church's side door, moving through the shadows of adjacent buildings until he reached the edge of the main street. From here he could see the full tableau. Hawkins, standing impatiently in the center, flanked by armed men with Isabella and Gabriel, held at gunpoint by a burly man whose face Mason vaguely recognized from the war. Taking a final deep breath, Mason stepped out into the harsh sunlight of the main street, hands raised slightly to show he was unarmed. "Hawkins," he called, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "I'm here. Let them go." A ripple of movement passed through the gathered men as all eyes turned toward him. Hawkins himself went momentarily still, as if he couldn't quite believe Mason had actually appeared. Then a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "Mason Redwood," he called back, satisfaction evident in his tone. "The man who vanished. It's been a long time." "Not long enough," Mason replied, walking forward with deliberate calm, stopping about 30 paces from where Hawkins stood. "Let the woman and child go. They're not part of this." Hawkins's laugh was cold and brittle. "On the contrary, they're very much part of this. Mrs. Diaz here is a witness to certain business dealings I'd prefer remained private. And the child is the legal heir to property I've invested considerable resources in acquiring." "The Diaz silver mine," Mason stated flatly, watching Isabella from the corner of his eye. She had shifted slightly, angling herself to shield Gabriel more effectively, her gaze locked with Mason's in silent communication. "Is that what this is about? More land for your empire?" "Among other things," Hawkins admitted. But you and I have our own unfinished business, don't we, Redwood? 7 years of unfinished business. Mason maintained his calm facade, though inside tension coiled like a spring. I left your service. That's all. What happens after doesn't concern you. You took something that belonged to me, Hawkins countered, his tone hardening. Something irreplaceable. And I want it back. Mason's brow furrowed in genuine confusion. I took nothing but my freedom. Liar! For the first time, Hawkins's composure cracked, raw anger seeping through. The dispatch case. My private papers. You stole them the night you deserted. Understanding dawned on Mason. The leather case Hawkins had always kept with him during the war, containing personal correspondence and what Mason had assumed were tactical documents. He'd never seen its contents, had forgotten its existence until this moment. I didn't take your dispatch case, Hawkins, Mason said truthfully. I haven't seen it since the war. Hawkins studied him with narrowed eyes, searching for deception. Then, who else knew its value? I have no idea what was in that case or why it matters to you, Mason replied, taking a careful step forward. From the corner of his eye, he could see movement at the upper window of the hotel, Caleb in position. What matters now is that you're surrounded, Hawkins. There are federal marshals on their way from Santa Fe, and they have enough evidence to hang you 10 times over. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Hawkins's face before his arrogant mask slipped back into place. Bluffing, Redwood, I expected better from you. No bluff, Mason countered, nodding toward the hotel. Caleb Cooper has been gathering evidence against you for months. Ledgers, contracts, witness statements. Everything needed to prove your involvement in human trafficking, murder, and fraud. As if on cue, Caleb appeared at the window, holding up the oilskin packet for all to see. It's over, Hawkins, he called. I've sent copies to every federal office from here to Washington. Killing us won't save you. Hawkins's men exchanged uneasy glances, some shifting nervously as they processed this information. Mason used their distraction to move a few steps closer to Isabella. You're lying, Hawkins snarled, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Cooper's boy is bluffing. Am I? Caleb replied, opening the packet to display several pages. These are copies of your own records, Hawkins. Shipping manifests listing human beings as cargo, financial transfers to Judge Palmer, and most damning of all, your order for the execution of Mateo Diaz signed in your own hand. Murmurs rippled through the gathered men, uncertainty spreading like a contagion. Mason saw his opportunity and seized it. Your men aren't fools, Hawkins, he called, addressing not just Hawkins but his hired guns. They know when a ship is sinking. The smart ones are already calculating whether loyalty to you is worth the hangman's noose. The man holding Isabella at gunpoint shifted uncomfortably, his grip on his weapon loosening slightly. Isabella noticed tensing in readiness. Hawkins sensed the changing mood, his composure cracking further. Shut up, Redwood. You've always been a silver-tongued devil, but words won't save you this time. He drew his own pistol, aiming it squarely at Mason's chest. I may hang, but I'll have the satisfaction of sending you to hell first. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. Mason held Hawkins's gaze, knowing that any sudden movement would trigger violence. But he'd accomplished what he'd set out to do. Shifted attention away from Isabella and Gabriel, sowed doubt among Hawkins's men. Lower your weapon, Hawkins. Sheriff Cooper's voice, weak but commanding, came from the direction of the church. He stood in the doorway, bloodied but upright, his badge gleaming in the sunlight. You're under arrest for the murder of Mateo Diaz, the kidnapping of Isabella Diaz and her child, and the assault of a peace officer. The distraction was all Isabella needed. In one fluid motion, she drove her elbow into the ribs of the man holding her, twisting away as he doubled over in pain. Gabriel clutched tightly to her chest. She darted toward the nearest building, seeking cover. Everything happened at once after that. Hawkins, enraged at seeing his hostages escape, fired at Mason, the bullet tearing through the flesh of his left arm. Mason dropped to one knee, drawing the hidden derringer with his right hand and returning fire. His shot went wide, but forced Hawkins to dive for cover. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as some of Hawkins's men broke ranks, either fleeing or turning on each other in the sudden chaos. Caleb provided covering fire from the hotel window, while Cooper, despite his injuries, managed to drop one of Hawkins's men who had taken aim at Mason. Mason scrambled behind a water trough, blood flowing freely from his wounded arm. Through the chaos, he caught a glimpse of Isabella reaching the safety of the general store, disappearing inside with Gabriel. "Redwood!" Hawkins's voice rose above the gunfire rage, twisting it into something barely human. "Face me, you coward!" Mason peered cautiously around the edge of the trough. Hawkins had taken cover behind an overturned wagon, but his position was exposed as more of his men abandoned him, sensing the tide had turned. This was the moment Mason had been waiting for. Hawkins, isolated and desperate, no longer surrounded by loyal protectors. With a grimace of pain, Mason checked his derringer, finding one shot remaining. One chance. Make it count. Drawing a steadying breath, Mason prepared to make his move. But before he could, a new voice rang out from the far end of the street. Roland Hawkins, a tall figure in a dark coat and wide-brimmed hat, strode forward, flanked by 6 armed men wearing federal marshal badges. "This is Marshal James Blackwood. You're surrounded. Surrender your weapons immediately." The unexpected arrival of federal authority froze everyone momentarily. Hawkins, trapped between Mason on one side and the marshals on the other, looked wildly around like a cornered animal seeking escape. "It's over, Hawkins," Mason called, rising carefully from behind the trough, his wounded arm held close to his body. "Surrender." For a moment, it seemed Hawkins might surrender, his shoulders sagging as the tide of power visibly shifted. Mason saw it in the man's eyes, calculation giving way to desperation, then to something more primitive, something cornered. "Last chance, Hawkins," Mason called steady, despite the warm blood trickling down his wounded arm. "It's over." Hawkins's eyes darted from Mason to Isabella, then to the marshals approaching from the east end of the street. His lips curled into a snarl that transformed his aristocratic features into something barely human. "Nothing is over while I still breathe, Redwood." With the explosive fury of a cornered mountain lion, Hawkins burst from behind the wagon, pistol leveled. His first shot kicked up dust at Mason's feet. The second tore through Mason's sleeve. Time slowed, as it always did for Mason in moments of mortal danger. He registered everything with crystalline clarity, the sweat beading on Hawkins's forehead, the wild fury in his eyes, the trembling of his gun hand that betrayed his panic. 7 years of plotting, of empire building, of believing himself untouchable, all collapsing around him. "You took everything from me," Hawkins screamed, closing the distance between them with each desperate stride. "My future, my legacy." Another shot wide by inches. Everything. Mason remained motionless, the tiny derringer concealed in his palm, seemingly insignificant against Hawkins's larger revolver. But Mason knew what Hawkins had forgotten in his rage. It wasn't the size of the weapon that mattered. It was the calm behind it. "This is for Rebecca," Mason whispered, too quiet for anyone but himself to hear. As Hawkins came within 10 paces, Mason's arm extended in one fluid motion, the derringer's sight aligning with Hawkins's chest. The sound of the shot was almost swallowed by the ambient chaos, but its effect rippled through the street like a stone dropped in still water. Hawkins staggered mid-stride momentum, carrying him forward 2 more steps. His expression shifted from rage to disbelief as he looked down at the small, almost insignificant hole in his expensive waistcoat, now blooming crimson. "You?" Hawkins managed his voice suddenly small. The pistol slipped from his fingers, thudding into the dirt. "I was building an empire." "You built nothing," Mason replied quietly. "You only destroyed." Hawkins took one more lurching step forward, arm outstretched, as if to grasp something only he could see, then crumpled to his knees. His eyes, still fixed on Mason's, showed no remorse, only surprise that his assumption of invincibility had finally failed him. Then he pitched forward into the dust of the street he had sought to control, blood mingling with the earth that would never be his. For 3 heartbeats the street went silent, a collective intake of breath, before chaos resumed. Hawkins's remaining men, seeing their invincible leader fallen, threw down their weapons one by one, hands raised in surrender as the federal marshals moved in. The sudden fall of their leader seemed to break the remaining resistance among Hawkins's men. Those still present threw down their weapons, raising their hands in surrender as the federal marshals moved in to secure them. Mason swayed slightly, blood loss and exhaustion finally taking their toll. He might have fallen had a strong hand not gripped his uninjured arm, steadying him. "Easy, Redwood," Cooper said, his own face pale from his injuries. "It's over. We won." Mason looked past Cooper to where Isabella emerged cautiously from the general store Gabriel held tight against her. Their eyes met across the distance, relief and something deeper passing between them. "Not over," Mason corrected, his voice rough with emotion. "Just beginning." The church had been transformed into an impromptu infirmary and headquarters for the federal marshals. Mason sat on a wooden pew, grimacing as Dr. Wilson cleaned and bandaged his wounded arm. "You're lucky," the doctor commented, tying off the bandage with practiced efficiency. Bullet passed clean through muscle, missed bone, and major blood vessels. "Doesn't feel lucky," Mason muttered, flexing his fingers experimentally and wincing at the resulting pain. "Trust me," Wilson replied dryly. "I've seen men lose arms from less. You'll heal, given time and rest." Across the church, Isabella sat with Gabriel the baby, now sleeping peacefully after the chaos of the morning. She caught Mason's eye and offered a small, tired smile that lightened his heart despite everything. Marshal Blackwood approached, his weathered face serious beneath salt and pepper hair. "Mr. Redwood, if you're up to it, I have some questions." Mason nodded, gesturing to the space beside him on the pew. "How did you know to come? We weren't expecting federal intervention so quickly." "Judge Monroe in Santa Fe received a packet of evidence 3 days ago," Blackwood explained, settling his large frame onto the pew. "Anonymous but comprehensive enough to warrant immediate action. When we learned Sheriff Cooper had been taken prisoner in his own jail, we moved up our timetable." Mason glanced toward Caleb, who was in deep conversation with another marshal, gesturing to the documents spread before them. "The younger Cooper has been gathering evidence against Hawkins for months, at considerable personal risk." "So I understand," Blackwood acknowledged. "His testimony, combined with Mrs. Diaz's and the documentary evidence, should be more than enough to prosecute Hawkins's entire operation." He paused, studying Mason's face. "But there's still the matter of Hawkins himself." "He's dead," Mason stated flatly. "Justice served, perhaps," Blackwood allowed. "But there are questions that remain. Hawkins seemed to believe you took something from him, something valuable enough to fuel a 7-year obsession." Mason shook his head. "A dispatch case he carried during the war. I never saw its contents, never took it. Whatever it contained died with him." "Maybe not," came a new voice. Father Miguel approached, carrying a small wooden box. This was among Mateo Diaz's possessions, secured in the strongbox. His key opened. He set the box on the pew between Mason and Blackwood. "I believe it may contain the answers you seek." Mason stared at the box, recognition dawning slowly. It was old, the wood darkened with age, and handling brass fittings tarnished, but still functional. On the lid, barely visible beneath years of wear, was carved a simple design: a hawk with outstretched talons. "Hawkins' dispatch case," he breathed, reaching for it with his uninjured hand. "Mateo must have found it," Isabella said, joining them with Gabriel sleeping against her shoulder. "But he never mentioned it to me." With a sense of opening a long-buried tomb, Mason lifted the lid. Inside lay several folded documents yellowed with age, and beneath them something wrapped in oilskin. Mason carefully unfolded the top document, scanning its contents with growing disbelief. "Land deeds," he said, looking up at the others. "To properties all across the territory, including—" he paused, swallowing hard. "Including the Diaz silver mine." "Let me see that," Marshal Blackwood requested, taking the document with careful hands. After examining it closely, he looked up, his expression grave. "These aren't legitimate deeds, Mr. Redwood. They're forgeries masterfully done, but forgeries nonetheless." Hawkins was planning to take control of half the territory through fraudulent documentation, Mason realized. That's what he's been building toward all these years. Not just the silver mine, but everything. And Mateo discovered it, Isabella added, her voice tight with emotion. That's why Hawkins had him killed. Not just because of the human trafficking, but because he found these documents. Mason continued through the papers, each revealing another layer of Hawkins's corrupt empire. Forged deeds, fraudulent contracts, blackmail material on territorial officials. But it was the item wrapped in oilskin that made his blood run cold. A small leather-bound journal, the pages filled with Hawkins's precise handwriting. A record of his accomplishments during and after the war, including the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened his ambitions. And there, on a page dated 7 years earlier, the entry that changed everything: "Redwood remains troublesome. His investigation into the rustling incidents threatens to expose our operation. Steps taken to neutralize potential interference. Messenger intercepted wife's condition to be left untreated. Without her influence, he will either fall in line or self-destruct. Either outcome serves our purpose." Mason stared at the words, the world around him fading as their meanings sank in. Hawkins hadn't just failed to help when Rebecca fell ill. He had actively prevented help from reaching her, intercepted Mason's messages, ensured she would die alone and afraid. "Mason," Isabella's voice seemed to come from very far away. "What is it?" Wordlessly, he handed her the journal, his hand shaking with suppressed rage and grief. Isabella read the entry, her face paling as she understood its significance. "Oh, Mason," she whispered, reaching for his hand. "I'm so sorry." Marshal Blackwood read over her shoulder, his expression hardening. "This journal documents dozens of crimes spanning nearly a decade. Murders, corruption, fraud." He looked up at Mason, compassion tempering his official demeanor. "Including the deliberate action that led to your wife's death, Mr. Redwood." The world around Mason receded, voices becoming distant echoes beneath the thundering of his pulse. The revelation rewrote a chapter of his life he'd read 1,000 times in grief and self-recrimination. Where he had seen personal failure, a husband's ultimate betrayal in choosing duty when love needed him most, now stood deliberate malice. Hawkins hadn't merely allowed Rebecca to die, he had orchestrated her passing like a conductor leading musicians to the final devastating note. The bullet may have been fever, but the finger on the trigger belonged to Hawkins. a murder designed to either break or bend a man who stood in his way. "He got what he deserved," Sheriff Cooper said quietly, from where he sat nearby, his injuries bandaged, but his eyes clear and alert. "Justice may not have come through official channels, but it came nonetheless." Mason looked up, meeting Cooper's steady gaze, then Isabella's concerned one. In her arms, Gabriel stirred small hands reaching up to touch his mother's face. The innocent gesture, so full of trust and love, cut through Mason's rage like sunlight through storm clouds. Rebecca was gone. Nothing could bring her back, not even the knowledge that her death had been Hawkins's doing rather than Mason's failure. But Isabella and Gabriel were here alive, their future now secure from Hawkins's reach. "What happens now?" Mason asked, his voice rough with emotion, as he looked to Marshal Blackwood. In the days following Hawkins's death, Silver Creek transformed. Marshal Blackwood's men methodically dismantled the empire Hawkins had built, arresting associates and freeing those who had suffered under his control. Judge Palmer was caught fleeing to Mexico. Cooper reported, his bruised face showing satisfaction. And 6 more of Hawkins's lieutenants were apprehended near Santa Fe. Today, Caleb, working alongside the marshals, added, 3 dozen people held against their will at the mining camps have been freed. The territorial governor sent additional officers to ensure it's done properly. Mason watched Isabella absorb this news, pride mingled with grief that Mateo had given his life to make it possible. Gabriel slept peacefully in her arms, unaware his father's courage was reshaping the territory he would grow up in. Judge Monroe arrived from Santa Fe a week later, a tall man with piercing eyes that seemed to measure everything they fell upon. "I've reviewed all evidence Mr. Diaz compiled," he informed them. "Remarkable documentation. Your husband's meticulous attention to detail will bring justice to hundreds, Mrs. Diaz." Turning to Mason, the judge continued, "Regarding Hawkins's death, given the circumstances and clear evidence of his intent to commit further violence, I've ruled it justifiable self-defense." He handed Mason an official document. "This closes the matter legally." Mason accepted the paper with a nod. Not satisfaction exactly, something closer to closure. "What about Hawkins's remains?" Isabella asked quietly. "He'll be buried in an unmarked grave outside town," Blackwood answered. No ceremony, no marker. Mason found a certain justice in that. A man who had sought to own half the territory would end up with just 6 feet of anonymous earth. "Now we dismantle Hawkins's empire," Blackwood replied. "Arrest his associates free, those he's trafficked, restore stolen property to its rightful owners." He nodded toward the journal. "This evidence will be crucial in that process." "And the silver mine," Isabella asked, "Gabriel's inheritance, will be confirmed as Diaz property with you as guardian until your son comes of age," Blackwood assured her. "Hawkins's fraudulent claims will be invalidated." Isabella nodded, relief evident in her features. "Then Mateo didn't die in vain. His son will have the future he wanted for him." The conversation continued around Mason plans being made, statements taken, the machinery of justice grinding into motion. But he remained silent, processing the revelation that had rewritten 7 years of grief and guilt. It wasn't until much later, when the church had quieted and most had departed to their various duties, that Isabella found him sitting alone in a far pew, the journal open in his hands. "You should rest," she said, gently settling beside him with Gabriel sleeping against her shoulder. "It's been a long day." Mason looked up, really seeing her for the first time since discovering the truth about Rebecca's death. Despite the exhaustion evident in every line of her body, Isabella's eyes remained clear and compassionate. "How do you do it?" he asked quietly. "How do you keep going after everything?" Isabella considered the question, her gaze dropping to Gabriel's peaceful face. For him, she answered simply, and because Mateo would want me to live, not just survive. She looked back at Mason, just as Rebecca would want for you. The words struck home with unexpected force. Rebecca had been full of life, of joy, even in difficult times. She would have hated what Mason had become in her absence, a hollow shell going through the motions of existence without truly living. I've wasted 7 years, he said, the realization bitter on his tongue. No, Isabella contradicted softly. You've survived 7 years. You built a home, helped neighbors, kept your humanity when it would have been easier to lose it. Her hand found his warm and steady. And when the moment came to make a choice between safety and doing what's right, you chose right. That's not waste, Mason. That's preparation. Preparation for what? Isabella's smile was gentle but knowing. For whatever comes next. For the future. The concept of future had been abstract to Mason for so long, a gray horizon without definition or promise. But sitting here with Isabella's hand in his, and the weight of Rebecca's death finally shifting from crushing guilt to honest grief, he found himself considering possibilities that had seemed unimaginable just days before. The ranch will need rebuilding, he said after a long moment. Hawkins's men did considerable damage, I imagine. We can rebuild it, Isabella replied, the simple we containing worlds of meaning. Mason looked at her, really looked, seeing not just the brave woman who had fought alongside him, but the possibility of companionship, of family, of a life reclaimed from the ashes of the past. Yes, he said, covering her hand with his. I believe we can. The wheels of justice ground forward with deliberate slowness after Hawkins's fall. Throughout the hot July days and into the sweltering August heat, Mason and Isabella found themselves traveling repeatedly to Santa Fe, giving testimonies, identifying co-conspirators, and establishing Gabriel's rightful claim to his inheritance. The federal courts moved with methodical care to unravel decades of corruption, while Hawkins's former associates faced judgment one by one. By September, life began finding new rhythms. The Redwood Ranch, badly damaged during Hawkins's brief occupation, became a project that healed more than just buildings. Each repaired wall and mended fence seemed to close a chapter of violence, making room for something new to grow in its place. Neighbors who had kept their distance for years, intimidated by Hawkins's shadow or respecting Mason's isolation, now appeared regularly with tools and willing hands, eager to be part of the restoration. Never thought I'd see old man Jeffries volunteer for a barn raising, Cooper remarked one evening, watching the elderly rancher from the next property hammer shingles with surprising vigor. That man hasn't left his own land in 3 years. People want to be part of something good, Isabella observed, passing around canteens to the workers. After so many years of fear. As October's crisp air finally broke summer's grip on the land, the physical scars of conflict had largely faded from the ranch. New timber gleamed golden in the autumn light. The repaired barn stood straighter than before, and fresh white paint covered the bullet holes in the main house's walls. Only Mason and Isabella knew where each scar had been markers of violence, now overlaid with renewal, but not forgotten. The main house stood whole again. Windows replaced bullet holes, patched new furniture built to replace what had been destroyed. The barn had required more extensive repairs, but now stood sound against the coming winter, filled with hay and supplies for the small herd that once again grazed the pastures. Mason sat on the porch steps, watching Gabriel crawl determinedly across the blanket Isabella had spread on the grass nearby. At 9 months, The boy was a bundle of energy and curiosity, constantly exploring his expanding world with fearless enthusiasm. "He's going to be walking soon," Isabella observed, settling beside Mason on the steps, a cup of coffee in her hands. "Nothing will be safe then." Mason smiled, the expression coming more naturally to him with each passing day. "We'll manage." "Mason Redwood optimist," Isabella teased gently. Who would have thought? The easy companionship between them had deepened over the months of rebuilding, evolving into something neither rushed to define, but both cherished. They shared the house as they shared the work, with mutual respect and growing affection, giving each other space when needed, but increasingly finding comfort in proximity. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Sheriff Cooper and his son Caleb appeared around the bend in the road, riding at an easy pace toward the ranch house. "Visitors," Mason observed, rising to greet them. Isabella scooped up Gabriel, who protested briefly at the interruption of his exploration before becoming distracted by the approaching riders. Cooper looked better than he had in years, Mason thought, as the sheriff dismounted with a nod of greeting. The older man's injuries had healed well, and the successful dismantling of Hawkins's criminal empire had restored much of his former vigor. "Nathan, Caleb," Mason welcomed them. "Coffee's hot if you're interested." "Wouldn't say no," Cooper replied with a smile, removing his hat as he climbed the porch steps. "Mrs. Diaz looking lovely as always." Isabella acknowledged the compliment with a gracious nod. "Sheriff, Caleb, to what do we owe the pleasure?" The four of them settled on the porch, Gabriel happily occupied with a wooden horse Mason had carved for him. Cooper accepted the offered coffee, taking an appreciative sip before addressing the purpose of their visit. "Two pieces of news," he said, setting his cup down. "First, the federal prosecutor has secured convictions for the last of Hawkins's associates, Judge Palmer among them." "Good," Mason said with genuine satisfaction. "They deserve every year they get." "More importantly," Caleb added, "the territorial governor has officially recognized Isabella's claim to the Diaz silver mine on Gabriel's behalf. The deed was registered yesterday." Isabella's breath caught. "Truly, it's official." Caleb nodded, withdrawing an envelope from his jacket. "The paperwork signed and sealed. The mine and all its assets are legally Gabriel's, with you as trustee until he comes of age." Isabella took the envelope with trembling hands, tears gathering in her eyes. "Mateo would be so pleased," she whispered. "This means Gabriel will have the future we dreamed for him. Education, opportunity, security." "Speaking of opportunity," Cooper said, exchanging a glance with his son, "that brings us to our second piece of news, or rather, a proposition." Mason raised an eyebrow, curious. "What kind of proposition?" Caleb leaned forward, enthusiasm brightening his scholarly features. "The territorial legislature has approved funding for a new school in Silver Creek. A proper school open to all children, regardless of background or heritage." Isabella's eyes widened. "A school like the one Mateo and I dreamed of creating." "Exactly like that," Caleb confirmed. "And they're looking for a headmistress with experience teaching children of different cultures. Someone who speaks multiple languages and understands the unique challenges of education in the territory." Understanding dawned on Isabella's face. They want me to run the school." "Your name was the first suggested," Cooper said warmly. "Your reputation as an educator is well known, and after the events with Hawkins, many in town see you as something of a hero." Isabella looked stunned, her gaze moving from Cooper to Caleb, then to Mason, as if seeking confirmation that this was real. "You'd be perfect for it," Mason told her quietly, meaning every word despite the conflicting emotions her potential departure stirred within him. "But Isabella gestured vaguely at the ranch around them, at Gabriel, at Mason himself. "We've built so much here. I couldn't just leave." "No one's suggesting you would," Caleb hastened to clarify. "Silver Creek is less than an hour's ride. You could maintain your home here while working at the school." Relief washed over Mason, though he was careful not to show it too plainly. The thought of Isabella and Gabriel leaving the ranch had struck him with unexpected force, revealing just how deeply they had become entwined with his sense of home. "It's a generous offer," Isabella said, collecting herself. "When would they need an answer?" "The school is set to open with the new year," Cooper replied. "So there's time to consider." The conversation shifted to other matters: the progress of rebuilding in town news from Santa Fe, the approaching winter. But Mason could see Isabella's mind working behind her attentive expression, calculating possibilities, weighing options. Later, after their visitors had departed and Gabriel had been put down for his afternoon nap, Mason found Isabella standing by the corral, watching the horses graze in the autumn sunshine. "You should take the position," he said without preamble, coming to stand beside her. "It's what you and Mateo wanted, a school where any child could learn regardless of background." Isabella turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "It is, but things have changed since then. I have Gabriel to consider, and—" she hesitated, something vulnerable entering her gaze. "And there's us, Mason. Whatever this is between us." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken feelings and possibilities. In the 3 months since Hawkins's death, their relationship had evolved in small, careful steps. Shared meals, quiet evenings on the porch, the occasional touch of hands or meeting of eyes that lingered longer than strictly necessary. But neither had pushed for definitions or declarations, both still healing from their respective losses. "Isabella," Mason began, then paused, searching for the right words. "I want you to be happy. You and Gabriel both. If running the school will bring you joy, then you should do it. And if staying here is part of that happiness, then know that you will always have a home on this ranch." Isabella studied his face, reading the deeper message beneath his careful phrasing. "Is that all we have here, Mason, a home?" The directness of the question demanded equal honesty in response. Mason took a deep breath, stepping past the caution that had governed him for so long. "No," he said quietly, "not just a home, a family, or the beginnings of one, if that's what you want too." Isabella's eyes softened, a smile touching her lips. "Gabriel already thinks of you as a father, you know. The way he watches for you lights up when you enter a room." "And his mother?" Mason asked, his voice roughening with emotion. "What does she think?" Instead of answering with words, Isabella closed the distance between them, rising on her toes to press her lips gently to his. The kiss was brief, but filled with promise, a beginning rather than an ending. "I think," she said as she drew back, her eyes meeting his steadily, "that Mateo would approve, and that Rebecca would want you to be happy." Mason's throat tightened at the mention of Rebecca's name, but not with the crushing guilt that had once accompanied it. Instead, he felt a bittersweet gratitude for the love they had shared and for the chance at a new beginning he now held before him. "The school needs a building," he said after a moment, his practical nature asserting itself. "Something solid, well-designed, with plenty of light and room to grow." Isabella laughed, the sound bright in the clear autumn air. "Are you offering your services as a builder, Mr. Redwood?" "I am," Mason confirmed with a small smile, "and my support for its headmistress in whatever capacity she might need." Understanding passed between them, an agreement, a commitment, a future unfolding with possibilities neither had dared imagine months before. 2 weeks later, Mason stood in the newly completed nursery, putting the finishing touches on the cradle he had carved from pine. It was the same design he had created 7 years earlier for the child he and Rebecca had expected, but this time completed with hope rather than sorrow. Gabriel, perched on Mason's hip, reached out curious fingers to touch the smooth wood. "Careful there, little man," Mason cautioned gently. "The finish is still drying." Isabella appeared in the doorway, watching them with a smile that held equal parts tenderness and amusement. "You two seem to be getting along fine without me." "We manage," Mason replied, settling Gabriel on the floor, where he promptly began crawling toward his mother. "Though I'm not sure how much help he's actually providing with the construction." Isabella scooped up her son, pressing a kiss to his dark curls before looking around the transformed room. What had once been a locked shrine to Mason's grief was now filled with light and life. Cheerful curtains at the windows, a small bed for Gabriel as he grew older, shelves already filling with toys and books. "It's perfect," she said softly. "Thank you, Mason." He crossed to her, drawing both her and Gabriel into a gentle embrace. "No," he murmured against her hair. "Thank you for bringing life back to this house, to me." Isabella leaned into his embrace, Gabriel babbling happily between them. Through the window, the New Mexico sun cast long afternoon shadows across the land that had once seemed a place of exile to Mason, but now felt truly like home. Their path forward would not be without obstacles. Isabella's role at the school would demand dedication and patience. The silver mine required careful stewardship, and wounds carved over lifetimes wouldn't mend in mere seasons. Yet in this moment, with Isabella's warmth against him and Gabriel's small hands clutching his shirt, Mason recognized the unfamiliar lightness spreading through his chest. It wasn't merely relief or contentment. It was possibility, the quiet dawn after the longest night, the first tender shoots pushing through scorched earth. Not just the grim determination to endure, but the audacious courage to flourish. To build not a fortress against further loss, but a sanctuary where joy might take root and grow, nourished by three souls who had learned the precious fragility of love and chosen it anyway. Later that evening, as the three of them sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Mason reached into his pocket and withdrew a small silver ring, simple but elegant, crafted by the silversmith in Silver Creek, from the first pure silver extracted from the Diaz mine since its reopening. "I had this made," he said quietly, holding it out to Isabella. "Not to replace what you had with Mateo, but to honor what we've found together." Isabella's eyes widened as she understood what he was offering. "Mason, we've both lost people we loved." He continued, his voice steady, despite the emotion behind his words. "Those losses shaped us, brought us to who we are now. I don't want to erase that past, but I do want to build a future. With you and Gabriel, if you'll have me." Isabella looked from the ring to Mason's face, tears gathering in her eyes. "Are you certain this isn't just gratitude or obligation? This is love," Mason said simply. "Different from what I felt for Rebecca, different from what you felt for Mateo, but real nonetheless. What do you say, Isabella Diaz? Will you make a family with me here on this land?" For answer, Isabella held out her left hand, fingers trembling slightly as Mason slipped the ring into place. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Gabriel, sensing the significance of the moment, in the way children somehow do, reached out small hands to both of them, drawing them together in his own wordless blessing. As darkness fell across the New Mexico territory, the Redwood Ranch stood as a beacon of light and warmth against the gathering night. Inside, a family that had been forged through loss and struggle tempered by courage and compassion looked toward a future bright with promise. Mason Redwood, who had once believed himself beyond redemption, had found it at last, not in solitude or penance, but in the love of a woman as strong as she was gentle, and a child who offered the chance to be the father he had once thought forever denied him. The land that had witnessed so much pain now cradled their hope, a fitting sanctuary for three souls who had journeyed through darkness to find each other. A true land of redemption, where wounds could heal, love could grow, and new beginnings were not just possible, but embraced with open hearts and steadfast courage. The end.